Well, hello there. I am Chris Hunt, and this is a new type of episode for the Code of the West podcast. Where to begin? I have some notes here with me, so I'm going to be referring back to them as needed. Well, this is my first week of being out on my own again. So it's been since 2020 that forgetting that I have a hat here. I've worked for somebody, had a real adult job since 2020 when I came down to Salt Lake City to work for Black Rifle Coffee. Before that, I occasionally had, a day job, but it was usually a part-time thing, either just to supplement my income or it was a way of getting out of the house or the apartment that I was in while I was working on comics or doing freelance, which is primarily what I did over the past, how many years now? I'm not terrible at math, never do it in public. About 14 years. I've been trying to make a living with just drawing and telling stories in various capacities. For 4 of those was working at Black Rifle or the company I most recently was working at, which was a holding company over a couple of outdoor brands called Kryptek and PSE Archery. It's basically hunting clothes and bows to, bows and arrow, like Robin Hood stuff. And for those of you who are kind of just jumping into the Code of the West thing here recently, I started Code of the West while I worked at Black Rifle Coffee back in December of 2021, Christmas Day, basically, Christmas Eve. Started it while I was still working and still running the art department at Black Rifle. And even at one point was Evan had talked to me and we agreed that I was going to roll Code of the West into Black Rifle as a sub brand. And we got pretty far into that before I left. I mean, it was in motion for sure, but I was able to. Evan was really cool about it when I decided my time was up and I needed to move on, and I was able to get Code of the West back completely in my own hands, which is pretty cool and incredible. And so I guess what I'm getting at is up until now, I've always had some sort of safety net in the background with Code of the West, even to the point that at the beginning there, like I'm saying, I almost was going to skip the line. Basically, I was going to have funding and an investment essentially in Code of the West through Black Rifle to get this thing going. It didn't work out, obviously, as I was saying, and we can get into a different podcast at some point. But I'm glad it didn't work out. And even at the time, even though it was disappointing, I knew that it meant that there was going to be a different path for me to go on, and that probably would end up being better because I'd have ended up earning it. So that's the funny thing. Now, after almost 3 years, so it'll be 3 years this December, this is the first time I'm on my own again with Code of the West. So what I wanted to start doing is doing like a weekly recap, because I know a lot of you that I talk to are trying to do similar things, whether that's start your own brand or your own podcast. Podcast is kind of a byproduct of what I'm trying to do with Code of the West. Always was. I'm the stated goal of Code of the West is to bring back this shared story that we have as Americans and this identity. And it took me a while to figure out how to show that and how to present it. It took me about 2 years, actually. And if you'd followed along from the beginning, Code of the West mostly has a presence on Instagram right now, more than anything, more than the YouTube or the TikTok, which I have been playing around with a little bit. Yeah, it's like 131,000 folks following on Instagram now. But for the first 2.5 years, let's say two years and a quarter, it capped out at like 5,000, which I thought was pretty great. And I worked pretty hard to try to figure out how to get there, and I just didn't do it very well. That's what I put it. Which we'll come into this whole experience. I'm not gonna talk about everything right now because, like I said, I'm gonna be doing this for indefinitely for right now, once a week. And so I figured there's gonna be things that come up that will give me reasons and context to talk about some of the stuff that I've had to unpack and learn over the years, these past few years. But the whole path has led here too. Anyways, that's all to say that this whole attention and larger following is a more recent thing. And it's funny though, because it took me all this, I guess 16 months to get to the point where I feel like Code of the West finally started, which was back in February of this year, when I kind of figured out how to start treating Instagram like a storytelling medium as opposed to just some sort of like I don't know, AI tool that I had to try to maximize, which I think is how a lot of people try to use it. An AI tool that you try to maximize to use as a marketing tool for a lot of stuff. So not only would I would actually say Code of the West is only about March, April, May, June, July, August, September. I would say Code of the West is really only 7 months old because everything that happened before that, I think this sounds better, right? You can let me know in the comments. Everything prior to that was an experiment, and it's still very much an experiment, but I had zero conception of what I was doing. However, did know that the mission I created for myself was important to me. And so I was going to figure it out, and I knew that I couldn't figure it out in a vacuum. So I was going to have to go out in front of people and fail, quote unquote. And that's fine. I'm okay with that. But like I said, it took a while. It took a lot. I wouldn't say they were big failures. They just weren't successes. And I know that can feel like a failure to people sometimes, a lot of times. So I got some notes here, like I said. So I'm just going to try to get through this. I'm going to fail in front of you since I've never done this before and just kind of figure out my way through this because I basically want to be able to hit certain things and hopefully create this sort of resource for people who are trying to do their own thing down the road or right now. So the first thing that I really wanted to kind of mention in the lead up to knowing that I was going to get laid off, having the ships burn behind me, I realized that there were a lot of things that I had just put off with Code of the West because it wasn't necessary. Time wasn't there. I was able to keep things going just by selling some t-shirts every once in a while, selling some coffee. I could keep the Shopify running, could pay for the domain service and all that stuff. And, in the meantime, I could keep brand building, which is what has really been on my mind. That's the storyteller in me. I love building brands, and I love figuring out things with other brands, which comes into play later here in this conversation. So I sat down and tried to actually figure out what the business was that I had started. When I started Code of the West, I knew I wanted to make t-shirt. I mean, the whole thing kind of came about from me accidentally creating a t-shirt concept. And so I knew I wanted to make t-shirts and make hats, but I didn't want that to be my business. Like I wasn't trying to start a lifestyle brand. I didn't know what I was starting, but I just knew that I wanted those things. I wanted to make those things because they made me happy. I liked making stuff at Black Rifle. It was different than making comics. People could wear it and interact with it in a more direct way than, say a comic book. Same with the coffee. So I set about figuring out just simple ways to release those things. I did drops, kind of like Montana Knife Company does, and some of the other knife makers, and had this like kind of beautiful mind webbed spider web chart figured out that I had spent way too much time on to try to articulate to myself how creative would feed these different elements of the business, so to speak. And I got really, this is early, mind you, but I got really obsessed with or fixated on rather, like what Code of the West, like what the structure of Code of the West was going to be, like how I was going to tie everything together and how one thing would feed the other. And these are all important things, but what I've realized is they're not really important at the beginning. At the beginning, you don't, because of how it played out, the reality that I'm in at this moment, post February, is completely unlike the reality prior to February. So every plan that I made was based on there not being anybody here and just trying to limp along. The thing that I've learned or remembered rather firsthand is that you can't, you're not going to get anywhere if you don't see where you're trying to go. That whole time prior to February, I was just kind of trying to only look at what I could do with the limited resources that I had. And biggest limited resource I had was time, because that's the other benefit of my background as a storyteller and an artist and a creative director is like I can do all this stuff. Can't necessarily do it all well, but I can pick a camera up, I can edit, I can draw, I can write. These are all things that you'd have to pay someone else to do if you were starting a brand most of the time. So I was able to kind of get a leg up that way. And I got really obsessed with just thinking about, okay, how do I tap into all these different things that I can do without paying anybody or putting a lot of money into it? And I got stuck there. I just got totally sucked into this just, what can I do in a couple of hours mentality? So When I found out that I was getting laid off, I realized that I needed to actually kind of come up with what the business plan was and figure out what the thing was. I've been calling it a storytelling engine since the beginning, but I didn't really know what that meant, other than it was just a way for me to kind of explain to myself that like story is the center of it, and the story that I'm trying to reignite and share with people. It didn't occur to me that I might have created a media company accidentally. And as I was exploring the different types of business models that were out there that existed, I mean, I ran into a lot of dead ends because, I mean, you can go to school to learn how to run a manufacturing business or, a legacy media company, but it's, at least in my explorations, a little bit harder to figure out how to define something that hinges upon social media, not just social media as a marketing tool, excuse me, but like the central part of the business. And, there's people out there like Mr. Beast or Chris Williamson who has got modern wisdom. But for some reason in my mind, that's not what I was doing. In my mind, why I honestly didn't know. I was trying to reconcile the desire to tell stories, to draw, to take photos, to take videos, to do documentaries, to have experiences, to meet people. I couldn't really figure out like how to package it. And the only way I could see making money was selling t-shirts and stuff. And I still don't want that to be like the primary focus of what the conversation is at Code of the West. I resent the idea of turning the Instagram into a constant ad and barrage of things to buy. I'm still getting better about talking about those things at all, which I think there is a bit of a place for it. But, I just don't want it to be a nonstop commercial like a lot of social media is now. So I made a new chart and then made a business plan out of that. And what I arrived at was I have a media and lifestyle brand. And when I was really looking at how I weighted, I made another spider web chart, but it was a lot less crazy. What I realized is that everything that I wanted to do really hinged upon and around media. I want to publish books. I want to write books. I want to do documentaries. I want to do the podcast. Kind of the list goes on. And I realized that over in the other side of this chart, where it said like merchandise basically is just like gear and coffee. So what I took away from that was, okay, because I had just kind of been in a flow state. I was just putting things together and brainstorming. I could talk pretty extensively about the things that I wanted to do that were story oriented in these different mediums. And I'm excited about Instagram. I'm excited about YouTube. I'm still looking at all these things from the perspective of when I was 18 or 19 and all these things were emerging for the first time. And it was this amazing democratized way of creating and sharing it with people. And it was super exciting. And I still find it exciting. It's not exciting to me to try and go sell a t-shirt at all. Really, it's exciting to make the t-shirt, but trying to sell it, very directly, I should say, is not fun. Finding a way to blend it with a story and have it sort of be like an invisible offer, maybe is a way of putting it. That sounds fun. That sounds hard. It is hard. I'm learning, but that seems like a noble thing to try. So I realized that I had a media company. And then there's the podcast itself, which has been this albatross around my neck since the beginning. Because when I started Code of the West, I just realized that, oh, well, I should probably learn how to do a podcast. That'll be important at some point. And it was a secondary thing to me. And then pretty quickly, I did this all the time at the beginning. I basically just talked at a wall. But I was at a loss for what to talk about most of the time. And so I talked about myself, which is funny because then that plays into what ended up popping the Instagram off in February. Is I realized that there were a lot of people out there when I started recording myself just thinking out loud, essentially, that thought the same way that I did and that felt the same way that I did and had similar experiences growing up as I had. And it made me deeply uncomfortable, actually, because I wasn't prepared for it. I had people very early on saying like, this is great, hell yeah, brother, basically. And I was just like, this isn't even a thing yet. It truly was just me going through a rehearsal in public, basically. And I was expecting nobody to really pay attention. So when people were paying attention, suddenly I was self-conscious of it. So the podcast stopped and started many times over the past almost 3 years because I would think that I was ready and I would start it back up. And then I would like listen to my gut. I'm like, nope, nope, nope. It's not there yet. And mind you, I hadn't figured out that Code of the West was a media company yet. So for me, I kept kind of looking at it going like, it just doesn't feel like the way I'm doing it or the loose plan that I had at that time. It just didn't seem right. Like my gut was telling me this is not the right time, but I'd still be getting some practice. I was still refining equipment and learning software. So it wasn't a complete loss by any means. And I have it all set up, the pipeline for Spotify and Apple and all that stuff. So when I realized I was losing my job and I made the business plan and I realized that I had a media company and I started taking stock of like, okay, it's a real different feeling now knowing that like the clock is ticking suddenly. I don't have to pay employees. I don't have to pay for a big ass warehouse or anything. But I mean, I've got to find a way to at least keep the lights on in my apartment so that I can try to find time in my free time to keep doing Code of the West. Because by that point, a month and a half ago when I found this out, I think at the time there was like 120 of you, 120,000 of you. And I'm like, now if I fail or if I can't keep up with it, now there's a vacuum in 130,000 people's lives. And I get messages that make me very emotional on the daily from those of you who are willing to share and are open about it, telling me about how important the page is and, sharing some pretty intense moments of your life and how the page has helped you. And I'm incredibly grateful and honored that this thing could help you in some way, and that my path and journey that's also been real weird and screwy at times can kind of help make people feel less alone. So with this realization that I needed to shit or get off the pot, basically, I realized that I needed to go kind of full tilt, or at least look at the possibility of what full tilt looked like. I'll talk about this a little bit further on, but this is the first time I've ever started a business, really. I've been self-employed many times over the years. More than I've been self-employed more than I've been employed in the past decade and a half. But I will say this: when you're on your own, there's a deeper focus that comes into play. This is a very, very clear focus. This week pretty much just snapped me out of a fugue state that I'd been in. So as I'm realizing basically that I have this media company that I'm trying to build now, the podcast comes back into focus as well. And I'm thinking, okay, this is the time to start looking at this seriously. And I think I'm looking at what I'm good at again. And one of the things that I'm pretty good at is talking to people. And I think that comes from being an awkward, introverted kid that didn't know how to be social. I had to reverse engineer it. And the main way I did that was just by realizing that everybody's as awkward and and kind of lonely, as the next person. And I just try to be the person for everybody else that I wish I had for myself most of the time. And I ask a lot of questions. I listen to the answers. Kind of makes for a decent podcast host in theory. So I just started sending notes out to people and asking if they would consider being on my podcast, and being pretty transparent about the fact that my page might be kind of bigger. I don't really know what constitutes big at this point, but wasn't going to really move the needle for anybody, the podcast probably. And started asking people, and people responded pretty quickly, actually. And I've been dreading this for a long time, and not worried about people saying no. I actually can't really tell you what's been wigging me out about it. I mean, a lot of people have asked me when I'd be more consistent with the episodes or when the next episode's coming. And people do enjoy just listening to me talk for some reason, or get something out of it anyways. And something that I'm still struggling with and getting okay with about Code of the West is that I might, like, I think every human hopes that their existence is felt in some way and acknowledged. I don't think humans are really well equipped to conceptualize that many people being aware of them and what they're doing. And it's not like all 130,000 people that follow the page are all on Instagram at the same time and all staring at me like they would be in a stadium. But it's an odd feeling, and I'm not worried about embarrassing myself, which is even probably odder. It's just an awareness that is deeply felt by me to not take this for granted and not just wing it completely anymore. I mean, like I said, I was winging it from day one, and I'm all for experimentation and trying new things, but I'm realizing that I can't just completely throw spaghetti against the wall all the time. So one of the things that I'm doing now is I'm focusing on building the podcast and getting guests that I want to talk to, that I want you to hear from, and to cover a bunch of different perspectives and backgrounds that I think are pertinent to the code. It might not necessarily be a cowboy that I'm talking to, but it would be somebody that I think exemplifies some aspect of the code or what it means to be an American, to live the American dream, to fight for the American dream. And I think that's pertinent. I think it's special, and I'm really grateful at the opportunity to possibly fail at this. In fact, I'm not going to say who I've been most recently talking to, because we haven't agreed on a time or date yet, and I'm used to things going sideways. But there's already a couple people that I'm flabbergasted are willing to sit down, even virtually, and talk to me, and I'm really excited to just have the opportunity to pick their brain and hopefully share a lot of value with you and the world. So yeah, outside of just the main goal is to just start getting the repetitions in with you posting it on YouTube, the podcast, that is, posting it on YouTube, posting it on Spotify and Apple, so that the video will be on the YouTube and the audio would be available on these other platforms. And I'm not thinking too far beyond that right now. It's the hardest thing about being a one-man band is that you have to know how to, well, for me anyways, I think you got to know how to allocate your bandwidth. You can't go down to the bottom of every rabbit hole that you want to go down, because you're not going to be able to be effective if you're just off. I mean, there's a million tangents I can go on all the time, and I just can't. I've got to sort of like give a certain amount of time to certain things, move on to the next thing, and then also balance what's actually paying the bills right now, because nothing at Code of the West is paying the bills other than it's paying for itself to remain operative right now. Without getting too far into the weeds on how I'm doing it right now, or with whom I should say, I've realized that there's a skill set that I've developed with Code of the West outside of the skill set that I had coming into it, that puts me in a position to be able to help other brands and tell their stories and do some art for them. And that's one way that I'm supporting myself now. I was a little nervous for the first, couple of days of this week, because I have work lined up, but there's when you freelance for yourself, you got to run down money constantly. It doesn't matter, even if you get like a little upfront, there's trying to get the money on the back end, and so I had this sort of gap where I'm like, this might be a rough month, this first month, me going on my own, but it's turned out to be okay. Like, I'm going to survive. I have at least 2 months of runway, which I mean is also like just kind of goes with the territory. It's like I don't have much more than that, so I got to keep going. But that's, I think, part of the reason why you have that hyper focus when you're doing it on your own. Like, there's no safety net. There's no, well, I'm going to get a paycheck this week, which means that your brain just kind of, at least for me, knows that it's time to go. Like, I've been getting up. I'm exhausted right now, but I've been getting up at like 4:30 or 5, not because I set an alarm, because that's just where my brain wakes me up at. Like, and I need to get a few hours in before the rest of the world wakes up. I mean, just, God, what did I do today? Yeah, so I got up, worked on a post for Code of the West, wrote a lot, took a lot today to actually do a post. Did a bunch of research for this one podcast guest that I'm talking about, and then wrote down a couple drafts of questions that I then refined, and then had cleaned, organized, set up this new space, which it's an old space, but I've just been trying to streamline the gear setup. I mean, I can't tell you how much money I've spent just on trying microphones and soundproofing and, cameras and all this other stuff. And I'm using Riverside and an iPhone right now. And I got like probably $30 in lights. The microphone is the most expensive thing here. And it's probably the fourth microphone I've gone through since I started the podcast back in January of 22. And this is just what I'm rolling with. Oh, and the headphones are plastic and from Amazon for like $20, but I actually really love the headphones, so I'm not complaining. So as far as the podcast goes, my loose plan, which is probably a little bit more involved than most people would consider loose, is to do what I'm doing right now once a week, basically just catch up. For anybody who's thinking about going into their own, or I guess chasing their own dream, making a vocation source of income, I want to be able to sort of show what that process is like to some degree. I can't show you everything just because it would take too much time to show you what I'm doing, and I wouldn't actually be doing the things that I need to be doing. But I can kind of recap, the sort of the high level stuff that's going on, and and hopefully you guys can get some value out of just that. I know there are a lot of people that follow the page that are looking to take some sort of step towards their dreams or a different kind of life or a different life goal. So once a week, I'll be doing this so that you can kind of follow along and hopefully get something out of it. And then I think realistically right now, I would shoot for one big guest or one real human talking to me, probably once every 2 weeks, I think is probably the best way forward, with the goal to eventually get, once a week going. But it's just a lot to, be doing Code of the West, doing the freelance. I guess now at least I don't have the day job to add on to it. But, something that's kind of hard for me sometimes, and I think a lot of people who want to do their own thing, is being realistic about goals and timelines. And it doesn't matter how realistic you think you're being, life has a way of sort of like letting you know what you can or can't do, just in terms of the things it'll throw at you. And I'm thinking that right now, once every 2 weeks is probably the way to go. And that way I might have to rush through, and I can take the time I need to, research guests and get a hold of them and plan and that kind of thing. So the first guest will be this week, and it's Kylee Whiting, who is a young woman from Boise who's a former rodeo queen, and she's a barrel racer looking to go pro, but also has goals to have her own Western lifestyle brand at some point. She's in marketing right now. Her father, rather, actually started Kryptek, which is the hunting company that I used to work with. It's just interesting. It's interesting being almost 40 and talking to somebody who's 20 and hearing that, not just their perspective on, Western ideals and lifestyle, but also what she thinks about social media and the role it plays in her life. And she's somebody who's already thinking about planning a family, and so has already thought about how social media and devices will factor into that. So, and that's the goal, is to be able to present different types of people, backgrounds. Like I said, some people will be of the Western mindset. Some people will be East Coast Yankees that are still doing things that are very much in line with the code. And I think at the end of the day, the idea of the Code of the West is a way of distilling down this sort of philosophy or ethos of what it means to be an American, and to strive and drive and fight to build something that wasn't there before, and that how that freedom to do is an important ideal to hold on to. So the guests will be a reflection of that more than anything. And through the conversations and through recording these types of pieces of content, I want to try to hopefully dispel some of the misconceptions that I know people have about trying to do things like this. Things like this, meaning like start your own business, go after a dream. I think a lot of people tell themselves stories that aren't necessarily true, that are more a way to convince themselves of not needing to try, or not even needing to dream, rather, which is even sadder. And I think that not everybody should be in the position that I'm in. And that, what I mean by that is, you shouldn't try to be something that you're not. But I think a lot of us have convinced ourselves that we're something that we're not actually wanting to be. And even if we're not the thing that we want, we should at least be able to acknowledge what that thing is, and at least be able to make an informed decision about whether or not we're going to go somewhere uncomfortable potentially in order to facilitate that dream or that desire. And so that's kind of what I hope these sort of Sunday fireside chats could kind of be, is this sort of like way of showing you that, yeah, it's hard and it's tiring, but it's also doable. And it's not something that you have to be special to execute. It just is more of a willingness to go somewhere uncomfortable and unwillingness to give up because of discomfort. And so, hopefully we'll get something out of there. At the very least, I'm just going to have a weekly vlog, I suppose, to look back on at some point, whether this works out or not. But at the end of the day, it's not about talent or luck completely. I mean, I know a lot of people who are extremely talented, and it's just not enough to rise to the top or, get a lot of eyes on you. Like, I mean, sometimes people do get recognized for a high level of craftsmanship and execution, especially in this day and age, but it's difficult, and I think too often people who are dedicated to a craft get caught up in the craft itself and not realizing that there needs to be more at play in order to make it sustainable. Artists are very guilty of this. I think a lot of times they don't want to learn business. They don't want to learn how to speak on camera. They just want to make their thing and they want you to buy it. And I understand that. But if that's what you want to do, you have to also understand that you're going to have limitations to that. So, I guess that would maybe be a third layer to the cake is hopefully that there's some creative people out there following along too that realize that you can wear many hats. You can be you can be a multifaceted creative person, and that social media is not something that you have to inherently be weary of or scared of or look down upon either. At the end of the day, you're sharing your love, hopefully, of what it is you get to do. And I think it's a very special thing, and it's a very incredible time that we live in, that it's possible that we all are willing to consider giving up our time to just see people do what they love. And I think that's what I've struggled with actually in these past 3 years at Code of the West, is trying to understand that just my passion and my interests alone could be worth someone else's time, even though I'm not the one that's making the decision as to whether or not, you know, someone's going to give me their time. Why not just have a camera going if I'm going to do it anyways? Why not share it with people if I'm going to make it? But it's tend to feel almost bad or confused or feel guilty about the fact that people want to pay attention, and I'm having to get over that. And it's irrational. I don't even understand it, to be honest with you. I'm just aware of it. So these are the things that I'm working through. I'm getting better about the positive self-talk, as I've alluded to in the past. I'm starting to see that, there's a place for me in the world, and there's a place for my experiences and my subjective viewpoint. And what's art if not that? So yeah, hopefully there's opportunity for a lot of lessons to be gained out of this. And like I said, at the very least, it's either going to be a success at the end, or it's going to be a slow motion train wreck. So, you know, I think there's probably valid story arcs in both of those. So I look forward to seeing you here. I look forward to seeing what's going to happen in the coming months and in years, hopefully. I have no idea what's about ready to transpire, but it's kind of fun to think about. Even just the people who are willing to sit down and talk to me that I have lined up gives me pause to step back and be like, wow, why would these people be willing to talk to me? And then that's the negative self-talk. And then when I think about it from the perspective of the positive, the best I can really do right now is like, don't worry about it. If they're busy and they have a lot on their plate and they're willing to give you their time, I must be doing something right. And I feel like that's kind of the story. That's the best I can do with Code of the West right now. Even though that number's pretty big, and a lot of people would probably be content to just stop there. To me, it's a data point, is all it is, to just indicate that, like, okay, there's people who are seeing that there's value in these types of stories being told and these types of philosophies being perpetuated. And so, yeah, I guess I'm starting to feel a little bit better about things. So hopefully things continue to go okay. But if they don't, you'll hear about them first here. But yeah, so you guys have a good rest of your Sunday, and I will talk to you next Sunday, the same time, the same place. And then in the meantime, in between in between these two episodes, there will be a real podcast with another real human guest that you'll get to hear for the first time. And then 2 weeks after that, there will be another one, and so on and so forth. So this is what we're doing now. It's a media company. Go forth and conquer. Live with courage and keep your word. I'll talk to you soon.